Hello, my fellow Rubyists. Today I'm going to be changing it up a little bit. Rather than using Cursor and the Cursor Composer for development, I'm going to be using a product called Aider to do the AI code generation. And I'm also going to be using CSS Zero instead of Flowbyte and Tailwind for my CSS and components. Both Aider and CSS Zero are open source products, with Aider being licensed under the Apache 2.0 license on GitHub and having 23,000 stars, and CSS Zero being licensed under MIT and having 224 stars. And this is a fairly young project, but it is actively being developed. At the end of this video, I'll be going over what I liked about these tools and where I feel like they lacked when compared to my normal tool stack. So a quick summary of why you might choose these tools. In addition to being open source, CSS Zero is built for Rails. It also follows the Rails 8 no-build philosophy and is developed by a developer who has made other contributions to the Rails community, including the popular library called Authentication Zero. Aider goes beyond your typical code assistance by offering an agentic model similar to that of Cursor Composer and Cascade in Windsurf. It separates the reasoning from the actual code generation. Therefore, you can leverage the best language models for each. It is highly configurable and allows you to connect to almost any LLM. In the past, I've been using hero icons as my icon library, but at the recommendation of the CSS Zero developer for this project, I'm going to use Lucide. In this video, I'll be using these tools to create a simple, responsive, and reactive web application. This application allows me to create and categorize rich text notes so that I can access them on all of my devices. And of course, this application will be built using Rails 8 along with all of the Hotwire and SQLite goodness it offers. So without further ado, let's get this project started. Let's begin by generating our new Rails application using all of the defaults other than skipping, JBuilder, and system tests. Now I'll open the project in Cursor IDE. As with all of my projects, I've created a .cursor rules file at the root of the project that goes over all of the technologies that I'm using, including CSS Zero. This file will be in my GitHub repo if you're interested in checking it out. Next, I will be installing CSS Zero using the guide on their GitHub page. This process involves installing the gem and running a Rails generator install script. Like Authentication Zero and Rails 8 authentication, the project also includes a generator to add the source files, CSS files, and images for each component that you'll be using in the project. Running the command with the help option will show you all of the components that are available. Now you can run the command with a space-separated list of all of the components you wish to add to the project, and you can add components at any time. As you can see here, the generator generates the CSS and the SVG images required for each of the components. The GitHub README has a link to a lookbook site that contains the documentation and code examples for each component, showing how they look in both light and dark modes. Back on the README, you can see that this gem implements custom templates for scaffolds and authentication, ensuring newly generated views are using CSS Zero components and utility classes. I will be using Rails 8 authentication on this project, so we'll get a chance to see this in action. If you install CSS Zero after you've already generated authentication, you can go ahead and run the authentication generator again, and it will actually update the views. Running Rails DB migrate will create our authentication tables. Now I'll start the server and check out the authentication related pages in the browser. It looks like CSS Zero is applying my system level dark mode configuration, and the styling looks correct. Here's a pro tip. Git commit early and git commit often in case the AI goes off and starts hallucinating. It makes it easier to revert the changes. Now I'll open up a third terminal that I can use to run Aider in. I'm going to start Aider in architect mode, which means that Aider will evaluate a prompt as an architect using a reasoning model, and then it will actually use a different or potentially a different model to actually generate the code based on that reasoning. As you can see here, Aider allows you to configure 3 different models. The main model, which is the model it uses for the reasoning step, the editor model, which is the model it uses to generate the code, and a weak model that it uses to do simpler tasks like git commits. This can save you money by not using frontier models to do everything, but it also allows you to pick the best model for each job. For example, maybe OpenAI 01 for reasoning and Claude Sonnet 3.5 for code generation. Another great Aider feature is the ability to map your code base. This basically scans all of the files and finds all of the functions that are in each of the file, and it helps optimize it when it goes to generate code. You can add files and images to the context by using the add command. Here I'm adding our cursor rules file. As you'll see throughout this video, Aider will always show you a list of all the files that are in the context right above the cursor. Now that I've added the cursor rules file and I've mapped my project, I'm going to ask Aider what it knows about the project I'm working on. I have found this to be kind of a quality control step, and it allows me to fine-tune my cursor rules file and add additional files to the context when necessary. What you're seeing here is a feature I really like about Aider. If while doing its reasoning, it determines that it could use an additional file in the context, it asks you if you would like to add it, and then it restarts the reasoning process. In this case, it noticed I'm using Rails 8 authentication, and it asked if I wanted to add the authorization concern into the context. It then went on and did additional reasoning and added the additional files, the user model, the session model, the current model, and the sessions controller. To me, this is a super powerful feature. If you pause the video and read the output here, you're going to see that Aider did a fantastic job of reasoning about my project and articulating a summary back to me. And now it's asking my permission to edit files. I would also like to point out here that just above the cursor you can see that Aider keeps track of all of the tokens that I've sent and that I've received, and the cost of the current message and the overall cost of the session. At this point, Aider offered some improvements that we could work on, such as adding session expiration timeouts, two-factor authentication, password reset, session management, login activity and auditing, rate limiting, and enhanced security with token rotation. These are all great suggestions for later on, but at this point I'm going to jump into generating our application. I'm going to kick off this project using a wireframe that I created that also has a couple of sticky notes on it to help the AI out a little. As you can see from the mockup, we'll be creating a mobile-friendly, modern, responsive application that allows categorization of my notes. In the cursor rules file, I was very specific about using Hotwire and Stimulus to create a single-page application-like experience. One more commit and we will be off to the races. I'll map the files one more time and add our wireframe to the context. You can see here the files that we already have in the context. I'm going to go ahead and start adding in the CSS Zero CSS files that I know I'm going to need in order to build this user interface. And here you see a final list of the files I believe I will need in the context to generate this layout. Rather than a one-shot attempt at generating this application, I'm going to do it in steps, and I'm going to start with the layout. I'm not going to read the entire prompt, but I'll go ahead and summarize it. You can pause the video if you want to read it. Basically, I'm asking it to create the layout using CSS Zero for CSS. I'm asking it to apply all of the knowledge that it picked up from our cursor rules file. And I'm also pasting a URL to the sidebar layout in the lookbook file for CSS Zero. Aider will follow this URL, scrape the results, and add them to the context. But first, it's going to ask for permission to do so. In order to improve its scraping capabilities, it asks me to install the Playwright testing framework. I may do that at a later date, but for now I'm going to say no. And now the code generation begins. Aider will print out the results of its first reasoning pass and then ask you if you want to give it permission to make the changes to the files. This gives you a chance to review the changes before accepting or declining. Okay, now I'll go ahead and open a browser and check out the results, and it looks pretty good. It looks like we have our sidebar layout, and all of the styling looks correct. We have our categories over in the sidebar, and it looks like they actually have some mock data in here. Let's see what it looks like on mobile devices, and it looks pretty good. It looks like our sidebar is opening up as we expect and closing. I'm going to quickly add a user to our seed data so that we can test the authentication. I'll only want to add the user if the user table is empty. Now I will go ahead and apply the seeds. And we can jump on over to the browser and test out the authentication. Looks like the authentication was successful, but we don't have a root URL specified in the routes file, so I'm just going to go ahead and move on. Now I'll paste in the second prompt, which is asking Aider to generate the models and relationships to support the application. I am telling it that once I validate the models, we will move on and start creating the controllers and the views. It is giving me a nice summary of the outcome of its reasoning, and now it's asking me if I want to allow it to edit the files. Our open router cost so far is 20 cents. Now it's asking me if I want to create the new category model file. It is possible to configure Aider to approve all of the changes automatically, but I actually want to take my time in the beginning here so that I can better understand how Aider generates code. It looks like it is done generating the models and migrations. When it generated the migrations, it looks like it didn't actually put a timestamp on them, so I'll need to rename these in order to get them to execute properly. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and run the migrations, see if we have success, and we do. Another cool feature about Aider is the ask command, which gives you a chance to discuss a plan before actually considering it for implementation. In order to test this feature out, I'm going to ask it to evaluate our next prompt. With this prompt, I'm going to ask it to evaluate creation of the controllers and views, reminding it that I want to use Hotwire and Stimulus and that I want it to behave like a single-page application. Once again, if you're interested, I suggest you pause the video and read the prompt in its entirety. Because I renamed those migrations, it is warning me that those two files which were in the context are no longer available. I could go ahead and add those migrations into the context if I thought I needed them, but I don't at this point. Once again, the summary I'm getting is spot on, and it's actually asking me if I want to add the routes file into the context. It must have picked that up during its reasoning, and I'm going to say yes. Once again, it's picked up a couple of files it wants me to add to the context, so I'm going to go ahead and approve. When using the ask command, once it's done doing its reasoning, you can go ahead and type go ahead, and it will proceed to the implementation. There's a lot of code generation going on and approvals, so I went ahead and sped this up 3 times, as I have done throughout the video. Looks like it's done. Let's go back to the browser and try logging in and see what we get. Looks like we're able to log in. Let's see what functions. It looks like we're still using the mock data here. Clicking the add category isn't doing anything. Looks like our hamburger menu still opens up the sidebar. Let's take a look and see if we have any errors in the console, and it looks like we do. I'll go ahead and clear the console out and then see if I can figure out exactly what I did to cause the error. And it looks like it's clicking on add category. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this, and we'll see if Aider can fix it. Now going back to the browser, let's see what we have. It looks like add category is coming up in a modal dialog, which is what I wanted to do in order to kind of have that single page application experience, but it looks like we're getting a 404 error. All right, back in the browser, let's see what we get. Okay, I don't see any errors, and I see a success message at the bottom that I think I'll need to improve on. But the category is not showing up in the sidebar. I think I'll jump over to the Rails console and see if the record was added to the database. It might help if I didn't use terminal commands in the console. Okay, it looks like it was added successfully. It's just not rendering in the UI. I'm going to ask it to replace the mock data with the real data. Okay, I'm skipping a few minutes of going back and forth with Aider, trying to resolve an issue where the categories were not rendering without a page refresh. Eventually, I figured it out. It was actually trying to use a turbo stream append to append a partial to the wrong part of the DOM. But this is an example of what happens sometimes when the AI gets stuck in a loop. You actually have to intervene and solve the problems yourself. Rather than implementing my fix, however, I'm just going to use a prompt to give the AI guidance and see if it makes the correction. Aider enthusiastically responds with "good catch" and tells me that it will go ahead and make the change. Okay, let's test our add category capabilities. Make sure that we're able to close the dialog. And finally, let's create one, and it looks like it shows up. Once again, I skipped ahead a little bit through some uninteresting prompting and going back and forth with the AI, creating the notes. And at this point, the notes are pretty much functional. There's a lot of cleanup that needs to be done. The UI isn't exactly perfect, and there are a few bugs in the code. I made a change to have Aider use the CSS Zero alerts for our flash notifications here. It looks a lot better. The final feature I wanted to add is to be able to enable rich text to edit my note. And to do that, I'm using action text, which I installed with the Rails generator and installer and applied the migrations. And now I'm just adding the CSS Zero tricks component to give me the proper styling. What you're going to see now is a high-speed walkthrough of all of the features of the application we created in both dark mode and in light mode. And while that's going on, I'm going to give you my final thoughts on Aider and on CSS Zero. First with Aider, I like that it's open source, it has the ability to connect to a lot of models. It shows session information, including tokens, cost of prompt, and the overall cost of the session. I like that the architect has a two-step workflow with reasoning and editing, and allows users to choose the models for each. I like the ask feature. I like that it's highly configurable, that it allows images in the context, and it can scrape web pages. I like that it can map your code, and that it knows when to request that you add additional files to the context. As for CSS Zero, I like that it's open source, zero build, of course. I like that it has Tailwind-like CSS utilities. I like its generators, scaffold generators. I like that it only generates the components that you need. It doesn't take over the entire project, and it has a fairly rich set of components. The styles are nice, and I like that it uses stimulus out of the box. The final verdict is I'm going to continue to use both of these tools. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked the video, and we'll see you in the next one.